The moment she said it, I felt the air in the room change like someone had shut off oxygen. My mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore, stood in the center of her perfect Connecticut living room, crystal chandelier glowing above her like a crown she believed she owned everything under, and she looked directly at me and said, "You don't own anything in this house." Not a question. Not a misunderstanding. A declaration. Jason, my husband, stood only 6 feet away, staring at the floor like the words didn't belong to him. No one corrected her. No one even blinked. I remember my hands going cold as I realized I wasn't being spoken to like family. I was being erased like I was temporary furniture they never intended to keep. Before I continue, if this story truly resonates with you, take a moment to like and subscribe, and maybe share where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is there right now. Because I want to know where this moment is reaching people from, and only if this story speaks to your heart. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night everything in my marriage stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a courtroom. But to understand how I ended up standing in that living room, being told I owned nothing, you have to understand what led me there, because nothing about that moment was sudden. It was built piece by piece, silently, for years, and I didn't see it coming until it was too late. It started the day I moved into the Whitmore house after Jason and I got married, a house tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Hartford, where everything looked perfect from the outside but never felt like mine on the inside. At first, I told myself it was just adjustment, just boundaries, just a mother-in-law who liked control. But control has a way of growing quietly when no one challenges it. Margaret decided where I sat at dinner, what I contributed to conversations, even what rooms I didn't need to worry about. Jason never stopped her. He would just squeeze my hand under the table like that was supposed to replace words. I remember one evening, she handed me a stack of household documents and said, "Just know your name isn't on anything important here, so don't get confused about what belongs to you." She smiled when she said it, like it was advice. I laughed it off that day. I wish I hadn't. Weeks turned into months, and I started noticing how often I was reminded that I was a guest in my own marriage. Even the house felt like it had rules I didn't agree to. I would hear doors close when I entered rooms, conversations shift when I came closer, as if I was always one step away from hearing something I wasn't supposed to. Jason told me I was imagining it. That I was sensitive, that his mother just liked structure. I believed him because I wanted to believe I still had a place in that family. But then came the document I wasn't supposed to read. It was left on the kitchen counter one morning, partially hidden under a magazine, and something about the way it was placed made me stop. It wasn't addressed to me, but my name appeared inside it in a way that didn't make sense, not as a beneficiary, not as a spouse, but as someone listed without rights. I remember my heart slowing as I read it again and again, trying to convince myself I misunderstood legal language I wasn't trained for. That was the first time I felt something behind the surface of this family, something structured, intentional, and deeply wrong. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Because I needed to be sure. And that silence, that hesitation, is what led me back to that living room weeks later, standing in front of Margaret Whitmore as she said I owned nothing, while Jason said nothing at all. And I finally realized this wasn't just about me being unwanted. It was about something I was never supposed to find out existed in the first place, and what I saw on that paper, hidden in plain sight, is the reason a lawyer was about to walk through that door and change everything I thought I understood about my own life. Before that night in the living room, there was a long history of being quietly pushed to the edges of a family I once tried so hard to belong to. When I first married into the Whitmore family, I believed I was stepping into something stable, something structured, something I could grow into. Instead, I stepped into a hierarchy that already existed long before I arrived, and I was never part of it. Margaret Whitmore, my mother-in-law, had a way of making space feel like it belonged to her alone. Even small things carried weight in that house, like where the dinner plates were placed, which chairs were preferred, or whose opinions were spoken out loud, and whose were quietly ignored. I remember one Sunday dinner when I tried to help set the table, and she gently took the plate out of my hand and said, "Let me, Emily, "You are not familiar with how we do things here." She smiled while saying it, but it was not kindness, it was instruction. Jason, my husband, never corrected her. He would just look at me afterward and say, "She is just particular, do not take it personally." So I stopped offering to help. I started learning the boundaries instead of questioning them. Over time, I noticed patterns that were too consistent to ignore. When family decisions were made, I was either informed after the fact or not included at all. When holiday plans were discussed, I was assigned roles instead of asked for input. One Christmas, I spent hours preparing dinner while Margaret and Jason finalized travel plans for a ski trip I had not been told about until the morning they left. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a serving dish, watching them pack the car through the window, realizing I had been physically present in their lives but structurally absent from their decisions. Still, I told myself that marriage was adjustment, compromise, patience. I wanted to believe I just needed time to earn my place. But the imbalance was not only emotional, it was written into the way the house operated. Important papers were kept in locked drawers I was never given access to. Conversations would stop when I entered rooms. Even mail addressed jointly to Jason and me would sometimes be opened and sorted before I ever saw it. When I asked about it, I was told I was overthinking, that families do things differently, that I should relax. Then one afternoon, while Jason was out and the house was unusually quiet, I found a folder on the edge of the kitchen counter. It was not hidden, but it also did not feel like it was meant for me to see. Inside were legal documents connected to the property and financial structure of the house. My name appeared in them, but not in a way I understood. It was not the name of an owner, not even a clear legal beneficiary in the way I expected for a spouse. It was something more distant, more conditional, almost like I existed in the paperwork but not in the rights. I sat at that table for a long time, reading the same lines again and again, feeling something shift that I could not yet fully name. That night, I did not confront anyone. I simply placed the folder back exactly where I found it and went to bed pretending nothing had changed. But something had already changed. The way I looked at that house shifted, the way I listened to conversations shifted, even the way I heard Jason's silence began to sound different. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and noticed Margaret speaking quietly on the phone in the hallway, using a tone I had never heard directed at me before, controlled, deliberate, final. When she saw me, she stopped mid-sentence and smiled as if nothing had happened, but I could feel it now, something underneath the surface of everything I had accepted as normal. That was the moment I understood my life in that house was no longer just uncomfortable. It was structured in a way I had not been allowed to fully see, and somewhere inside that structure, something was already moving toward the surface that no one in that family was ready to explain. The first real crack in everything did not come with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly through a message I was never meant to see. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember sitting at the kitchen counter scrolling through my phone while the house felt unusually still, like the air itself was waiting for something. Jason had stepped out for work, and Margaret was upstairs making her usual calls. Her voice drifting faintly through the ceiling in that controlled tone she used when she believed no one important was listening. That was when Jason's phone, left charging on the counter, lit up with a notification. I did not intend to look, but the name on the screen stopped me. It was Margaret. I hesitated for only a second before picking it up, telling myself I was just checking the time. But what I saw was not a simple message. It was a thread of instructions, carefully written, almost rehearsed, and my name appeared in it in a way that made my stomach tighten. One line read, "Do not let her question the ownership structure. Keep her focused on household comfort instead." Another said, "She still believes she is entitled to this house. We need to correct that perception gradually." I sat there staring at the screen, feeling my heart beat slow instead of race, like my body was trying to process something my mind had not accepted yet. This was not confusion or misunderstanding. This was planning. I put the phone back exactly where it was, but nothing inside me returned to its place. That evening, I noticed the shift immediately. Margaret was kinder than usual, almost gentle, asking me if I wanted tea, asking about my day, even smiling in a way that felt rehearsed. Jason later told me she was just trying to improve the atmosphere at home. But now I knew better than to trust surface behavior. Over the next few days, small things began to change in ways that felt coordinated. Conversations about the house stopped including me entirely. When contractors came for maintenance, I was not informed. When financial discussions happened at the dining table, my presence became optional, then unnecessary, then quietly avoided. The most unsettling part was how naturally Jason adapted to it, as if someone had already explained to him what my role was supposed to be, and I had simply missed the meeting. Then came the document that broke the illusion completely. It arrived in an envelope addressed to Jason, but Margaret left it on the counter as if it belonged in open space. Inside was a revised property structure summary, and my name appeared only as non-ownership resident spouse with no equity claim. I remember reading that phrase over and over, each time expecting it to mean something different, but it never did. It was precise, legal, and absolute. When I finally asked Jason about it that night, he did not look surprised. He only sighed and said, "My mother has been handling the legal side of things for years. It is easier this way." Easier for who was not said out loud. I tried to speak, but every sentence felt like it was hitting something already decided. The final collapse came 2 days later during a dinner that felt staged from the moment it began. Margaret placed a printed statement on the table, announcing changes to household ownership clarity, as she called it. Jason did not question it. No one did. When I finally spoke, asking how my name had been reduced to nothing without my knowledge, Margaret simply looked at me with calm certainty and said I was misunderstanding my position in the family structure. That was the moment everything went quiet inside me. Not because I accepted it, but because I realized I had been living inside a version of reality that had already been rewritten without my consent. And I had just been handed the proof that the story I believed about my life in that house was already over before I ever realized it was being taken away. After that dinner, nothing in the Whitmore house felt stable anymore. It was not loud or dramatic. It was something far worse. It was silence with intention. I started noticing that conversations would stop the moment I entered a room, not abruptly, but smoothly, like they had already rehearsed how to include me out of them. Jason stopped explaining things altogether. Margaret stopped pretending she needed my input. Even the house itself felt like it had been reassigned, room by room, responsibility by responsibility, until I was no longer part of its structure, only its background. At first, I tried to fix it. I told myself this was a misunderstanding that could still be corrected if I explained how I felt clearly enough, so I started small. I asked Jason to talk. I asked for clarity. I asked for transparency about the documents I had seen, about the messages I had read, about the decisions that seemed to be made without me. Each time, he responded the same way, tired eyes, controlled voice, saying I was overthinking, that everything was legal, that I should not stress myself over family administration matters. That phrase stayed with me more than anything else. Family administration matters. It sounded like I had been reduced to paperwork. Then came the calls I made that were never returned. I called Jason during lunch hours, during evenings, even once while sitting in my car outside the grocery store parking lot, just trying to hear some version of the man I thought I married. Sometimes he answered and said he was busy. Sometimes he did not answer at all. I left voicemails that grew shorter each time, from explanations to questions, from questions to silence. I even tried Margaret directly once, swallowing my pride, asking if we could sit down and clear everything calmly. She never called back. Instead, I received an email from a shared family account stating that all household decisions were being centralized for efficiency. That word, efficiency, felt like it erased me more than any insult ever could. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening with a printed copy of that email in front of me, reading it again and again while the house around me stayed perfectly still. I started noticing physical reminders of my exclusion too. My name removed from small subscriptions I had once been included in. My access to certain accounts quietly changed. Even grocery deliveries shifted to preferences I had never selected. It was not one action that broke me. It was the accumulation of being treated as optional in my own life. One afternoon, I tried one last time. I wrote a long message to Jason, not angry, just asking him to meet me halfway, to explain what was happening, to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed between us. I sent it, then sat waiting for hours, watching the screen like it might still respond to me as if I mattered. When the reply came, it was short. He said he needed space and that I should respect how things were being handled by his mother. No apology, no explanation. Just distance, delivered in a single paragraph. That night, I realized something I had been avoiding for weeks. I was no longer participating in my own marriage. I was observing it from the outside. The final attempt came unexpectedly. I went to the Whitmore house while Margaret was home, determined to speak face-to-face without interruptions or messages filtered through Jason. I stood in the entryway and asked her directly why I was being erased from decisions about a home I lived in every day. She looked at me calmly, almost patiently, and told me I was not being erased. I was simply being corrected. She said I had misunderstood my position from the beginning and that resisting clarity only made things more difficult for everyone involved. There was no anger in her voice, only certainty. That was worse. When I left that house that evening, I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply drove for a long time without turning on the radio, listening to the sound of my own thoughts settling into something unfamiliar. And for the first time, I stopped trying to convince anyone that I belonged there. I stopped calling Jason that night. I stopped sending messages. I stopped waiting for explanations that were never coming. Instead, I opened my laptop when I got home and began doing something I had not done before. I started looking at documents, records, names, details I had ignored for too long, and in that quiet search, something began to shift inside me. Not hope, not anger, but something colder and clearer. The beginning of understanding that I was no longer going to ask for a place in a system that had already decided I did not deserve one. After I stopped waiting for answers from Jason and stopped trying to explain myself to Margaret, something inside me finally went quiet in a different way, not broken, but focused. I did not leave the Whitmore world in a dramatic moment. I left it in silence, one small decision at a time. I moved into a small rented apartment in Stamford, Connecticut. Nothing impressive, just a one-bedroom space with a second-hand couch, a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's detergent, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot instead of polished marble floors. For the first time in years, no one told me where to sit, what to say, or how to exist. I started rebuilding my life in ways that did not require permission. I took freelance consulting work in administrative legal coordination, organizing documents for small firms that treated me like a person instead of a placeholder. Every morning, I would sit at a plain wooden desk with a black coffee in a paper cup and a stack of files, and I would feel something steady return, not happiness, but control. One day, I was given a temporary contract badge for a legal advisory office downtown. It was simple, white plastic. My name printed clearly in bold black letters, Emily Carter, Legal Documentation Analyst. I remember holding it in my hand longer than necessary, just looking at it, because it was the first time in a long time that my name existed somewhere without condition. I started noticing how differently people looked at me when I walked into rooms with purpose instead of hesitation. Not respect exactly, but acknowledgement. I worked longer hours than before, not because I was forced to, but because I no longer wanted to return to a place where I felt invisible. Months passed. Then, years. I stopped checking whether Jason had called. I stopped checking whether Margaret had changed her mind. I stopped measuring my worth against their silence. Instead, I built routines that belonged only to me. Early morning runs along the river path, where the cold air sharpened my thoughts. Late nights reviewing documents that actually mattered. Slowly, my work expanded into larger legal coordination projects, and I was brought into consulting on property structuring cases, the same type of documentation that once made me feel powerless, now becoming something I could read without fear. The most symbolic moment came when I was finally issued a permanent professional ID badge from a firm I had worked with for over a year. It was heavier than the temporary one, engraved with my full name and role, and I kept it on my desk even when I was not at work, just to remind myself that I existed outside of someone else's definition. I never told anyone from that old life about it. I never needed to. One evening, after finishing a long day of reviewing property filings, I stood outside my apartment building holding a cup of coffee, watching the city lights blur slightly in the cold air, and I realized I was no longer trying to return to anything I had lost. I was simply continuing forward. And yet, even as I built this quiet independence, I sometimes thought about that living room, about the chandelier light, about the moment Margaret looked at me and said I owned nothing, about Jason standing there without a voice. I did not feel anger anymore when I remembered it, only distance, like looking at a life that belonged to someone else. Then one evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. A number I had not seen in a long time appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I just stared at it without moving. Because I knew before answering that whatever came next would pull me back to the moment I had once thought I left behind completely, the moment where everything had begun to fall apart in the first place. The days after I stopped answering unknown numbers felt quieter than I expected, not empty, just no longer controlled by other people's voices. My life had settled into something simple and real. I still lived in a small apartment in Stamford, still worked with legal documentation, still drank my morning coffee by a window that faced a parking lot instead of a chandelier, but for the first time, none of it felt temporary. I had learned how to exist without waiting for permission. Then one afternoon, I saw the message that pulled everything back into focus. It was from Jason. No apology, no small talk, just a request. He asked to meet. He said it was important. I did not respond immediately. I sat with it for a long time, looking at the screen, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer felt the need to rush toward pain I had already survived. Eventually, I agreed to meet him in a neutral place, a quiet cafe near downtown Hartford where neither of us had history. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting by the window, looking more tired than I remembered. There was no confidence in his posture anymore, only hesitation. He stood when he saw me, then sat back down as if unsure what version of me would walk in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said her name, Margaret, softly, like it carried weight he had only recently learned to feel. He told me she had been involved in legal arrangements surrounding the house for years in ways he never fully questioned. He said he had believed everything was normal until I left, until documents were reviewed again, until someone outside the family started asking the kinds of questions no one inside ever did. He admitted something simple but heavy, that he had allowed silence to become agreement. There was no dramatic confession, no raised voice, just a man slowly realizing he had been part of something he never understood. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was forgiving, but because I no longer needed to be defended or justified. When he finished speaking, he asked me if I would ever come back. Not to the house, but to him. I looked at him for a long moment and realized the answer had already been decided long before that conversation. I told him I did not hate him, but I could not return to a place where my voice had to fight to exist. There was no anger in my tone, only clarity. He nodded slowly, and I saw something in his expression break in a quiet way, not collapse, but acceptance. Before I left, I placed my hands around a simple coffee cup between us, feeling the warmth fade into something ordinary again, and I realized that this was what closure actually looked like. Not victory, not revenge, just distance that no longer hurt. Outside, the air was colder than I expected, but it felt clean, almost like breathing for the first time in years. I walked past the cafe windows and did not look back. In that moment, I understood something I had been learning all along. That home is not a place where you are allowed to stay. It is a place where you are no longer asked to disappear. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I carry from everything that happened is this. You cannot build peace inside a system that requires your silence. If this story reached something inside you, if you have ever felt invisible in a place that was supposed to hold you, then I want you to know you are not alone in that feeling. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop asking to be chosen and start choosing yourself. Trust what feels wrong, even when no one else sees it. Protect your peace even when it costs you comfort. And remember that distance from people who diminish you is not loss, it is protection. If you are listening to this and something in your life feels heavy right now, I hope you take a moment for yourself today. Just a moment of stillness, where you remind yourself that your value was never something someone else had the authority to approve. Thank you for staying with this story, for giving it your time and your attention, and for letting it exist alongside whatever you are carrying in your own life. I do not know where you are right now or what time it is there, but I hope, in some small way, you feel a little less alone after hearing this. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts, your city, or even just a word in the comments, because sometimes being heard starts with simply being seen. And if this story resonated with you, there are more stories like this waiting in the playlist, each one carrying another truth, another silence, another moment of becoming. Maybe I will see you in the next one, when another story begins where this one leaves off.